For more than 20 years, there was one ship that symbolized British naval power more than any other. Wherever it appeared, flags were raised, crowds gathered in ports, and allies felt relief. Enemies felt caution. Its name was synonymous with maritime supremacy, tradition, and imperial pride. For the United Kingdom, it was not just a warship. It was the Royal Navy. That ship was the HMS Hood. Built in the aftermath of the First World War, Hood was designed to be the largest, fastest, and most impressive warship in the world. A gigantic battlecruiser, armed with 15-inch guns, capable of crossing oceans at speeds high enough to hunt enemies, or escape them if necessary. For 2 decades, no other British ship carried as much symbolic weight as Hood did. Hood was not just steel and artillery. It was floating propaganda. A political instrument. A visible reminder that the British Empire still ruled the seas. Wherever Hood dropped anchor, Britain was present. But behind this image of invincibility, there were weaknesses. Some were known. Others were ignored. And some were simply accepted as the price of keeping an icon active in a world that was changing too fast. When the Second World War began in 1939, HMS Hood was no longer young. Naval technology had advanced. Gunnery had become more precise. Ammunition more destructive. Aircraft were beginning to reshape warfare at sea. And yet, Hood continued to be sent on the most important missions, not only because of its military capability, but because its presence carried a psychological impact that could not be replaced. Serving aboard Hood was an honor. For many sailors, it was the peak of a naval career. The ship brought together seasoned officers, young recruits, and veterans who had spent their entire lives at sea. On board, there was strict discipline, constant pride, and the feeling of being part of something larger than any individual. In the early years of the war, Hood patrolled the North Atlantic, escorted vital convoys, and took part in hunts for German surface raiders. Its primary mission was clear: protect Britain's maritime lifelines and confront any enemy warship that dared challenge the Royal Navy. Among those threats, one stood above all others. Nazi Germany had launched a new kind of adversary, a modern battleship heavily armored, armed with devastating guns, and designed to face any British opponent on equal terms, or better. Its name began to appear with growing concern in Royal Navy reports. When that ship finally put to sea, it became clear that confrontation was inevitable. HMS Hood was ordered to intercept it. There was no choice. No diplomatic alternative. The pride of Britain had to face the new symbol of German naval power. For London, allowing this enemy to operate freely in the Atlantic was unacceptable. For the men aboard Hood, the mission was clear, and heavy with meaning. What no one knew at that moment was that the entire history of HMS Hood, decades of service, prestige, and confidence, was about to be reduced to 3 minutes of combat. 3 minutes that would shock the world. 3 minutes that would change how naval warfare was understood. 3 minutes that would turn Britain's greatest pride into a national tragedy. And to understand how that was possible, we must now go back to the beginning, to Hood's design, the choices made during its construction, and the decisions that, years later, would exact a price too heavy to ignore. That is where this story truly begins. The HMS Hood was born out of urgency. During the First World War, the Royal Navy realized it needed ships capable of combining speed and firepower, something traditional battleships could not fully provide. The answer was the battlecruiser concept. Large, fast, armed like a battleship, but with sacrifices and protection. When Hood's keel was laid in 1916, it already carried enormous expectations. It was not meant to be just another ship. It was meant to be the ship, the largest ever built for the Royal Navy at the time. Its very existence was intended to deter adversaries and reassure allies. The problem was that it was born in a moment of transition. Naval warfare was changing faster than shipyards could adapt. Harsh lessons had been learned at the Battle of Jutland, where British battlecruisers had suffered catastrophic explosions after magazine hits. Hood incorporated some of those lessons with improved armor compared to its predecessors, but not enough to turn it into a true battleship. At its core, Hood was a compromise. Its side armor was respectable for its time, designed to withstand direct fire at relatively flat trajectories. The problem lay above. Its deck armor, responsible for protecting against shells falling at steep angles over long distances, was limited. In the early 1920s, that seemed acceptable. In the 1930s, it became concerning. By 1941, it was potentially fatal. Even so, Hood remained in almost continuous active service. Unlike other major warships, it never underwent a full modernization. Plans existed. Reports warned of the need for significant reinforcement, especially to the deck. Officers knew the ship needed it. But strategic reality intervened. The Royal Navy could not afford to sideline its greatest symbol. During the interwar years, Hood sailed the world. It visited colonies, took part in naval reviews, and hosted heads of state. It was floating imperial power. To the British public, the ship seemed eternal. To many sailors, serving aboard it was the pinnacle of a career. When the Second World War began, Hood was immediately sent on the most critical missions. Patrols in the North Atlantic. Hunts for German raiders. Escorting vital convoys on which Britain's survival depended. It was not merely a combat vessel, it was a psychological force. Its presence raised morale. Its absence was felt. But the enemy had changed. Germany was no longer relying only on cruisers and submarines. It was now fielding large, modern capital ships, designed using the most recent lessons of naval warfare, ships intended to fight at long range, firing shells capable of penetrating armor at angles once thought safe. When reports confirmed that one of these ships had entered the Atlantic, the British response was immediate. There was no time for hesitation. The Royal Navy needed to intercept and destroy the threat before it could begin attacking defenseless convoys. HMS Hood was chosen to lead the mission. Not because it was the most modern ship, but because it was the only one whose presence seemed equal to the challenge. For the men aboard, the orders were received with the gravity of those who understood the moment's importance. They knew this was not just another patrol. They were heading toward a confrontation that would be watched, judged, and remembered. The North Atlantic does not forgive mistakes. Cold waters, unpredictable weather, shifting visibility, an environment where decisions made in seconds can seal irreversible fates. And it was into this setting that Hood advanced to meet its enemy, a ship that represented everything Hood was not. New, modern, designed for a kind of naval war the world had only just learned to fight. The encounter ahead would not be long. It would not be balanced, and it would leave no room for correction. But before we reach those 3 minutes, we must understand the adversary, and why this particular confrontation was far more dangerous than it appeared on maps and in reports. That is where we turn now, to the other side of the Atlantic. On the other side of the Atlantic, Germany was preparing something the Royal Navy had feared for years. This was not a simple raider or auxiliary cruiser. It was a ship conceived to confront Britain's greatest warships directly, and defeat them. Its name already carried weight among naval analysts and intelligence officers: Bismarck. Bismarck was not just large. It was modern. Its design embodied everything German naval engineering had absorbed after the First World War: thick, well-distributed armor, efficient compartmentalization, advanced fire control systems, and guns capable of firing 380mm shells with devastating accuracy at long range. It was not built to run. It was built to fight and survive. The German mission, known as Operation Rheinübung, had a clear objective: break into the Atlantic and attack British supply routes. In 1941, the United Kingdom depended desperately on maritime convoys to continue the war. Sinking merchant ships was a slow but effective way to strangle the nation. A ship like Bismarck, operating freely, could inflict catastrophic damage. Escorted by the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, Bismarck left the Baltic in May 1941. From the first moment, it was tracked with intense urgency by the British. Reconnaissance aircraft, radio intercepts, fragmented reports. The Royal Navy knew this was no ordinary threat, and that it had to act fast. The British response was immediate and massive. Nearly everything that could float was dispatched to locate and intercept the German force. Among those ships was HMS Hood, accompanied by the newly commissioned battleship HMS Prince of Wales. On paper, the pairing made sense. Hood's speed and symbolic weight combined with the modern firepower of Prince of Wales. But there was a structural flaw in that decision. Hood, despite its size and guns, was not a modern battleship. Its deck armor remained vulnerable to plunging fire, the exact kind of engagement expected at long range in the North Atlantic. Bismarck, by contrast, had been designed for precisely that kind of fight. What was approaching was not just a clash of ships, but a collision between two eras of naval warfare. In the early hours of May 24, 1941, the two forces closed in on each other in the Denmark Strait, between Greenland and Iceland. The sea was rough. Visibility was limited. Conditions were harsh but acceptable for a battle no one wanted, yet everyone knew was unavoidable. Aboard Hood, sailors were already at their stations. Many had endured storms, gunnery exercises, and countless false alarms. But this moment was different. The tension was unmistakable. They knew the enemy ahead was not a cruiser trying to escape, but a battleship prepared to fight. British orders emphasized closing the distance quickly, attempting to neutralize the German advantage at long range. Tactically this made sense, but it exposed Hood precisely where it was weakest. Advancing head-on meant presenting the deck at dangerous angles before its own guns could achieve full effect. In the final minutes before combat, there were no heroic speeches. No music. Only the sound of the sea, the engines, and short, clipped orders over the intercom. Men checked equipment, adjusted positions, and waited. When the first flashes appeared on the horizon, there was no turning back. The meeting between the pride of Britain and the new symbol of German naval power was about to begin. And everything HMS Hood had been, decades of prestige, voyages, and confidence, was about to be tested in a span of time so brief it would seem unreal. The next 3 minutes would not merely destroy a ship. They would redefine what the world believed about naval power, tradition, and invulnerability. It is at this instant, when the guns finally speak, that we enter the briefest and most devastating moment of this story. In the early hours of May 24, 1941, the Denmark Strait seemed suspended in time. The sky was gray, the sea rough, and visibility limited by low fog. It was not an epic scene in the classic sense. There was no rising sun, no clear horizon. There were only two groups of warships moving toward each other, fully aware that this encounter would not end without bloodshed. At 5:37 a.m., British lookouts confirmed visual contact. First shadows. Then mass. Then the unmistakable silhouettes of two large German ships cutting through the sea. HMS Hood and HMS Prince of Wales advanced in line, with Hood in the lead, as expected from the faster, more seasoned ship. Minutes later, the German guns opened fire. The first salvos fell short, throwing up towering columns of water around Hood. The crew felt the shock waves ripple through the hull. For many aboard, this was not their first combat alert, but it was their first against an enemy of this caliber. Hood replied, its 15-inch guns roaring through the gray silence of the North Atlantic. The battle had begun. The British desperately tried to close the distance. The logic was clear. The closer the range, the flatter the enemy shell's trajectory, and the lower the risk to Hood's vulnerable deck armor. But closing the gap required time. And time was exactly what the ship did not have. The Bismarck adjusted its fire with alarming speed. Each salvo landed closer than the last. Prinz Eugen also fired, adding to the visual and sonic chaos. The sea around Hood churned with impacts. Steel fragments and splinters began to rain down onto the deck. Then, at around 6 a.m., something changed. A German salvo struck Hood in a different way. Witnesses reported a blinding flash near the stern, followed almost instantly by a much larger explosion. Deep, muffled, as if it came from inside the ship. This was no ordinary hit. It was not a surface fire. It was the magazine. In a fraction of a second, HMS Hood ceased to be a warship and became a fireball. The explosion tore the hull apart. The forward section lifted into the air. The stern vanished beneath a colossal cloud of black and orange smoke. The sound was described as something beyond artillery, a continuous, overwhelming detonation. Final. The pride of Britain was being destroyed before the eyes of the world. Less than 3 minutes after effective combat began, HMS Hood started to sink. Not slowly. Not with time for an organized evacuation. It simply broke apart. The ship that had crossed oceans for more than 2 decades disappeared into the Atlantic in moments. Of the more than 1,400 men aboard, only 3 survived. 3 men hurled into the sea by the force of the blast, who managed to stay alive in the freezing water until they were rescued hours later. For the rest of the crew there was no chance. No prolonged struggle. No traditional heroism. Only sudden, total destruction. Aboard HMS Prince of Wales, the shock was immediate. Officers and sailors stared in disbelief at the spot where Hood had been seconds earlier. Many struggled to process what they had seen. A ship of that size simply gone. It should not have been possible. Not to Hood. Not like that. The psychological impact was devastating. For the Royal Navy, the loss was not merely material, it was symbolic. The ship that embodied British naval power since the First World War had been annihilated in minutes by a modern adversary. The myth of invulnerability had been shattered in the most violent way imaginable. The battle continued briefly afterward. Prince of Wales, still inexperienced and already damaged, was forced to withdraw behind a smoke screen. Bismarck pressed on, now carrying the weight of having destroyed the Royal Navy's most famous ship. But everything had already changed. News of Hood's loss reached Britain like a national shock. Headlines. Speeches. Silence. For a population already strained by bombing, rationing, and uncertainty, the destruction of Hood felt almost personal. It was brutal proof that no one, not even the most powerful symbols, was safe. And at the same time, it was a call for vengeance. The Royal Navy would not allow Bismarck to escape unpunished. From that moment on, the hunt would become relentless. Every available ship would be sent to sea. Every route would be watched. This was no longer only about strategy, it was about honor, morale, and response. But before we follow that desperate pursuit, we must pause. Pause to understand what truly happened to HMS Hood. Why it exploded the way it did. Why a single hit was enough. And what this tragedy revealed about the limits of tradition in a war that had already changed. That is what we must examine now, calmly, because the 3 minutes that destroyed Hood still echo far beyond that gray dawn in the North Atlantic. For a long time, the destruction of HMS Hood was surrounded by shock, silence, and unanswered questions. How could a ship of that size, the pride of an entire nation, be eliminated so quickly? The explosion was so sudden that, for years even within the Royal Navy, there was reluctance to accept the simplest explanation. Hood had fallen victim to its own structural limitations, exposed at the worst possible moment. Investigations launched after the battle began to converge on a consistent scenario. A German shell, fired by Bismarck, struck Hood at a descending angle typical of medium to long-range engagements. That shell did not need to penetrate the ship's thicker side armor. It only had to pierce the deck where protection was significantly weaker. All evidence suggests that this is exactly what happened. The shell penetrated Hood's aft deck and reached one of the ammunition magazines, where large quantities of propellant were stored for the main guns. What followed was not a localized explosion. It was a rapid chain detonation, far too fast for any human or structural containment. In practical terms, the ship was destroyed from the inside out. This vulnerability was not unknown. Since the 1920s, internal Royal Navy reports had warned of the urgent need to modernize Hood, especially by reinforcing its horizontal deck armor. Plans were drawn up for a major reconstruction, similar to those carried out on other ships in the fleet. But those plans were repeatedly postponed. First due to budget constraints, then because of naval treaties, finally because of the war itself. Hood was too large, and too important, to sit idle in dry dock for years. It was needed, visible, useful as a symbol. And so it continued sailing with protection that made sense in 1918, but not in 1941. The tragedy in the Denmark Strait made that brutally clear. For the Royal Navy, the impact was twofold. There was the immediate mourning for more than 1,400 men lost almost instantly. But there was also the strategic realization that the era of untouchable naval icons was over. Tradition, reputation, and history offered no protection against modern shells fired with scientific precision. The British response to Hood's sinking was immediate and visceral. The Admiralty issued a clear directive. Bismarck had to be destroyed. Not only to protect convoys, not only for military calculation, but because the loss of Hood had become a matter of national morale. From that moment on, the pursuit of Bismarck ceased to be a routine naval operation. It became a hunt. Ships were redirected. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, and battleships converged on the North Atlantic. The Royal Navy could not allow the ship responsible for Hood's destruction to escape. Meanwhile, the sight of Hood's sinking remained silent. Within minutes, the sea had closed over the wreckage. There was no time for large-scale rescues. No significant recovery of bodies. Most of the crew vanished with the ship in cold, deep waters. Decades later, when the wreck of HMS Hood was finally located on the Atlantic seabed, the extent of the destruction confirmed what eyewitness accounts had long suggested. The ship was broken apart. The bow separated from the stern. Physical evidence of a massive internal explosion. There was no longer any doubt. Hood had not merely lost a battle. It had been annihilated. That realization permanently changed how the Royal Navy, and the world, viewed its own symbols. Hood ceased to be just a ship lost in combat. It became a lasting warning about the danger of relying too heavily on the past in a war that was evolving too fast. And yet, its story did not end on that gray morning. Because HMS Hood lives on not only in how it was destroyed, but in how it was remembered. In the impact it had. In the decisions it forced. And in the symbolic void it left at the heart of a maritime nation. To understand that final legacy, and how 3 minutes echoed throughout the rest of the war, we must now look at what came after. At the mourning. At the British response. And at how the world began to rethink naval power after the loss of Britain's pride. That is the final movement of this story. News of the destruction of HMS Hood reached the United Kingdom like a physical blow. It was not just another wartime communique. It was a national shock. Within hours, the news spread through London, the ports, the industrial cities, and the coastal towns. The ship that symbolized the permanence of British power at sea had vanished in 3 minutes, taking almost its entire crew with it. The newspapers were cautious at first. Many headlines spoke of a serious loss, before confirming the true scale of the disaster. When the numbers became public, the impact deepened. More than 1,400 men dead. Only 3 survivors. For a nation already enduring constant Luftwaffe bombing, it felt like further proof that the war would spare nothing and no one. The mourning was not only personal. It was institutional. HMS Hood was not viewed as an ordinary ship. It represented historical continuity, imperial pride, and naval supremacy inherited from the previous century. Its loss exposed something deeply unsettling. Britain no longer ruled the seas by tradition alone. It would have to fight for control on brutally equal terms against modern adversaries. Within the Royal Navy, the reaction was immediate and unambiguous. The order issued by the Admiralty became legendary within hours. Sink the Bismarck. It was not a suggestion. It was an absolute priority. From that moment on, virtually every available ship in the North Atlantic was mobilized. Routes were altered. Secondary missions were cancelled. Aircraft carriers, cruisers, battleships, and destroyers converged with a single objective: to locate and destroy the German ship responsible for the greatest symbolic loss the Royal Navy had suffered in decades. That pursuit would become one of the most famous episodes of naval warfare, but its emotional origin was Hood. Every British officer involved understood this. Every sailor sent after Bismarck carried the image of the battlecruiser exploding on the horizon. At the same time, a quieter process began within the Admiralty. Concepts, doctrines, and priorities were re-examined. Hood's destruction made one reality undeniable. Deck armor, protection against plunging fire, and continuous modernization were not optional upgrades, they were matters of survival. The myth of the ship too big to fall quickly died with Hood. For the families of the crew, the grief was even harsher. There were no bodies for funerals. No traditional farewells. In many cases, only brief, formal telegrams confirming death in action. The sea had taken everything. Parents, wives, and children were left to live with total absence. No grave, no remains, only a name carved into memorials. Those memorials soon appeared. In ports, churches, and public squares. HMS Hood came to be remembered not merely as a ship lost in combat, but as a collective sacrifice. A warning forged in steel and salt water about the true cost of modern war. Ironically, that loss accelerated profound change within the Royal Navy. Blind faith in symbols gave way, slowly but decisively, to pragmatism. Modernization gained urgency. Naval aviation was taken even more seriously. The belief that tradition alone could protect a fleet was abandoned, painfully but permanently. Hood did not win a battle in its final minutes. But it shaped strategic decisions that would influence the rest of the war. And while Britain mourned its dead, Bismarck was still at sea. Damaged, yes, but free. For a few days, it carried the weight of having destroyed the Royal Navy's most famous ship. Those days were numbered. The hunt was underway. And it would not end without consequences. But before we follow Bismarck to its end, it is essential to understand what truly changed after Hood's sinking. In naval thinking, in public perception, and in how maritime power itself came to be understood. Because those 3 minutes did not destroy only a ship. They closed an entire era of naval warfare. And it is that silent, profound, and irreversible shift that we must now examine. The destruction of HMS Hood marked a breaking point that went far beyond the hunt for Bismarck. It exposed, cruelly and publicly, what many strategists already suspected but few dared to say aloud. Naval warfare had changed in nature, and the symbols of the past no longer guaranteed survival in the present. Until then, much of British naval doctrine still rested on concepts inherited from the First World War. The belief that large ships, well commanded and crewed by experienced sailors, could meet any threat. Hood embodied that belief. Fast, imposing, respected. A ship that carried the weight of history, and trusted it. The Denmark Strait proved that this was no longer enough. From that point on, the Royal Navy began to address, with urgency, issues that had previously been debated too cautiously. The vulnerability of horizontal armor, the need for deep, not incremental, modernization. The understanding that range, accuracy, and angle of impact mattered as much as caliber and tonnage. More than that, Hood's loss reinforced a trend that had been advancing quietly, the definitive rise of naval aviation. If a single shell, fired at long range, could destroy a symbol of that magnitude, what could hundreds of aircraft do? Unsurprisingly, in the months that followed, aircraft carriers moved to the center of British and Allied strategic thinking. Battleships remained important but no longer untouchable. The battlecruiser as a concept virtually disappeared. In many ways, HMS Hood was the last of its line. In the British public imagination, Hood's image also changed. Before the war, it was seen as a distant, almost mythical protector. After 1941, it became a symbol of sacrifice, a reminder that modern war spares nothing, not even what seems eternal. That psychological impact ran deep. Sailors serving on other ships began to face combat with a different awareness. If Hood could explode in minutes, any ship could. This did not produce panic. It produced realism, a hard acceptance that survival depended less on prestige and more on constant adaptation. In the years that followed, the Royal Navy would never again commit a major ship to decisive combat without carefully weighing its structural limits. Blind faith in tradition gave way to technical analysis, intelligence, and integration across forces. In this sense, Hood continued to serve even after it sank, shaping decisions that would save other ships and crews. Decades later, when the wreck of HMS Hood was found nearly 3 kilometers beneath the ocean's surface, the final image was devastating and clarifying. The ship lay broken apart, scattered across the seabed, silent proof that the explosion had been total, swift, and unavoidable. There was no failure of courage. There was a collision between a design from the past and a war of the future. Today, Hood is remembered not only as Britain's shattered pride, but as a turning point, a historical warning about the danger of relying too heavily on what once worked. A lesson written in steel, fire, and freezing water. And still, the story is not complete. Because beyond strategy, technology, and national impact, there is something that must never be forgotten: the men who were aboard. Sailors who woke that morning believing they served on the most respected ship in the fleet. Who followed orders to the last second. Who vanished almost without a trace. To fully understand the meaning of HMS Hood, we must now descend to that human level, beyond maps and reports, to grasp what it meant to serve on that ship, and what its loss meant to those left behind. It is in the silence left by the 1,400 men of Hood that this story finds its final and most enduring meaning. The HMS Hood sank too quickly for there to be individual stories of last-second heroism. There was no time for organized evacuation, for final messages, for conscious choices. Most of the men aboard died without fully understanding what was happening. And that is precisely why the human impact of Hood's loss was so profound, because it left no clear farewell narratives, only an abrupt and devastating void. More than 1,400 men were aboard. Experienced officers, seasoned sailors, young recruits on their first major deployment. Some had served on Hood for years. Others had joined recently, drawn by the prestige of serving on the most famous ship in the fleet. For all of them, that morning began like so many others in the North Atlantic. Cold, gray routine. In less than 3 minutes it was over. When the ship exploded, there was no time for organized shouting, for frantic runs across the deck, or for mass attempts at escape. The magazine detonation was instant and absolute. Many men died in the very second they became aware of the hit. Others were thrown into the sea by the violence of the blast, only to face freezing water, burning oil, and falling debris. Only 3 survived. 3 men out of more than 1,400. A number so disproportionate that it became a symbol of the violence of that moment by itself. Those survivors did not speak of heroism. They spoke of confusion, of extreme cold, of the silence that followed the explosion. They spoke of looking around and no longer seeing the ship they had served on. For the families, the loss was especially cruel. Unlike other naval battles where bodies were sometimes recovered, Hood vanished almost completely. The sea did not return its dead. For parents, wives, and children, there were no traditional funerals, no physical graves. Only names carved into memorials, and the certainty that their loved ones had been swallowed by the Atlantic. Across the United Kingdom, the impact was deeply personal. In many port cities, someone served on Hood. A neighbor. A cousin. A former classmate. The ship was too large, too famous to feel distant. Its crew represented a broad cross-section of British society. That is why the mourning was collective. HMS Hood ceased to be just a ship destroyed in battle and became a national human loss. In churches, names were read aloud. In ports, flags were lowered. In ordinary homes, chairs remained empty forever. As the years passed, Hood came to occupy a unique place in British memory. Not as a shameful mistake, nor as a meaningless defeat, but as a harsh reminder that modern war does not respect symbols. That tradition does not protect lives. and that the human cost can be devastating even when the fighting lasts only minutes. Today, when people speak of HMS Hood, they speak of 3 minutes. But for the men aboard, those 3 minutes marked the end of entire lives. Interrupted dreams, stories never told, futures that never came to be. The ship disappeared beneath the waves, but its crew did not disappear from history. They remain in records, in memorials, in families who inherited only photographs and old letters. They remain part of a lesson that war taught in the harshest way possible. There is still one final circle to close. To understand what HMS Hood came to represent after all this, how its destruction was absorbed into the memory of the war, and why, more than 80 years later, those 3 minutes are still remembered as one of the most shocking moments in naval history. It is toward that final, historical, symbolic, and definitive conclusion that we now move. Over time, HMS Hood ceased to be seen merely as a recent tragedy and came to occupy a deeper place in British historical memory. It was not forgotten, but it was never reduced to a simple symbol either. Hood became something more complex. A turning point, a permanent warning about the limits of naval power when tradition collides with reality. For decades, the exact location of the wreck remained unknown. The North Atlantic kept the ship in silence, nearly 3,000 meters below the surface. For many families, this physical absence prolonged the grief. Hood had no visible grave. The sea was all that remained. Only in 2001, more than 60 years after the battle, were the wrecks finally located. What the images revealed confirmed definitively what accounts had long suggested. HMS Hood was broken in two. The bow and the stern lay separated by hundreds of meters. There were no signs of prolonged fires. No evidence of internal fighting after the explosion. Only instant, catastrophic destruction. Those images closed decades of speculation. There had been no failure of command. No collapse of crew discipline. Hood had fallen victim to a fatal combination. A design conceived for another era, facing a modern opponent under conditions that exploited its greatest weakness. Over time, the Royal Navy formally acknowledged this reality. Hood came to be remembered not as a shameful mistake, but as a lesson paid for with human lives. A lesson that profoundly influenced British and Allied naval development for the remainder of the war and into the post-war era. After Hood, no other major British warship was sent into decisive combat without adequate modernization. Magazine protection, internal compartmentalization, and deck armor became absolute priorities. In silence, Hood continued to save lives. Within British naval culture, its name acquired a particular weight. It is not spoken lightly. It is not treated merely as a famous ship. HMS Hood is remembered as something that must never happen again. A permanent warning against technological complacency and excessive faith in symbols. And perhaps most importantly, Hood endures as a human memorial. The more than 1,400 men who died that morning are not remembered as passive victims. They were sailors who followed orders, trusted their ship, and faced the enemy without hesitation. They did not fail. The world around them had changed too quickly. Today, when historians speak of HMS Hood, they are not speaking only of a battlecruiser. They speak of the end of an era in naval warfare. Of the moment when it became clear that size, prestige, and tradition were no longer enough. Of the instant when the 20th century revealed its most impersonal and brutal face. That is why those 3 minutes still echo. Not only as an explosion in the North Atlantic, but as a historical landmark. As a national trauma. As a reminder that modern war grants no time for correction. HMS Hood now lives only in memory, in records, and names carved in stone. But as long as its story is told with fidelity, as long as we remember that it was destroyed not by cowardice, but by obsolescence in a rapidly changing world, it will continue to fulfill its final mission. To warn, to teach, and to remember. And when you hear that the pride of England was destroyed in just 3 minutes, understand this. Those 3 minutes are still teaching lessons today. Even after all the investigations, memorials, and technical analyses, something about HMS Hood was never fully laid to rest. Because unlike many other wartime losses, its destruction was too fast to be processed in the moment. The shock came later. And it kept returning, generation after generation. For the Royal Navy, Hood came to represent a very specific kind of historical responsibility. It was a reminder that decisions made in peacetime, delaying modernizations, trusting aging designs, keeping symbols active for political reasons, can exact an enormous price when war truly arrives. Not gradually but instantly. What makes it most unsettling is precisely this. There was no clear warning for the men on board. There was no prolonged engagement that allowed for adaptation or learning. Hood was given no second chance. It entered combat carrying decades of accumulated confidence, and met an enemy that had no respect for that legacy. That reality profoundly reshaped British naval thinking. After Hood, no major warship was considered irreplaceable. No reputation was treated as armor. The logic became cold, technical, almost impersonal. And paradoxically, that shift saved lives during the remainder of the war. Among sailors who continued to serve after 1941, Hood became a silent reference point. Not a paralyzing fear, but a constant reminder that modern combat does not forgive structural weaknesses. Many younger officers grew professionally under that shadow. They understood they were operating in a world where the past offered no guarantees. For the British public, Hood also changed how the war was perceived. Until then, there was still a sense that certain pillars of the empire were too solid to collapse quickly. The Blitz had already shaken that belief on land. Hood destroyed it at sea. War ceased to be distant and became personal, vulnerable, unpredictable. And yet, over time, HMS Hood came to be remembered as more than a tragedy. It became a moment of historical honesty, an event that forced the United Kingdom to look at itself without excessive romanticism. To accept that even the greatest symbols can fail when the world changes too fast. Today, when naval historians speak of Hood, they rarely do so with anger or shame. They speak with respect, both for the ship and for the men who died aboard her. They speak of a design that served well in its time, but was pushed beyond its limits by forces larger than itself. And perhaps that is the fairest way to remember HMS Hood. Not as a grotesque mistake, not as a shattered myth, but as a historical warning paid for with real lives. Only one final step remains in this story. Not about technology, not about strategy, but about the final meaning of those 3 minutes, and why, more than 80 years later, they are still remembered as one of the most brutal and symbolic moments in the history of naval warfare. When you say the word, we will close this journey. When we try to understand what those 3 minutes truly meant, we have to look beyond the instant of the explosion itself. Because HMS Hood was not destroyed only in the Denmark Strait. It was also destroyed in what it represented, the idea that certain symbols are too great to fall quickly. Until that gray dawn, there was an almost intuitive belief that British naval tradition functioned as a kind of invisible armor. That accumulated experience, historical reputation, and global presence created an extra margin of safety. Hood was the embodiment of that belief. And that is precisely why its loss was so devastating. 3 minutes were enough to show that modern war does not recognize the past. It responds only to the present, to physics, engineering, range, angle, and speed. The shell that pierced Hood's deck did not know it was striking the most famous ship in the Royal Navy. It simply did what it was designed to do. And that may be the hardest truth to accept. HMS Hood did not fall because its sailors failed. It did not fall because its commanders were reckless. It did not fall for lack of courage, discipline, or will to fight. It fell because, at that specific moment, it was placed in an irreversible structural disadvantage. 20th century naval warfare offered no time to learn in combat. It allowed no correction after a single critical mistake. Hood went into action carrying decisions made decades earlier, and paid for them in seconds. That is why, over the years, Hood came to be remembered not as a defeated ship, but as a warning marker. A permanent reminder that symbols must evolve alongside the reality they are meant to face. That keeping something in service simply because it has always been there can be as dangerous as open neglect. The men who died aboard HMS Hood did not choose to represent that lesson. They simply did their duty, trusting that the ship they served would protect them as it always had. That trust, legitimate and deeply human, is central to the tragedy. And perhaps that is why the story of Hood still unsettles us. It offers no easy comfort, no prolonged heroism, no balanced narrative of struggle. It offers only the stark truth of modern war. Sometimes, everything ends before there is time to react. When the sea closed over the wreck of Hood, it did not take only steel and men. It took an entire era of certainty with it. From that moment on, no ship would be seen the same way. No fleet could afford to ignore its own limits. And quietly, the 3 minutes of HMS Hood became part of the naval conscience of the world. Not as spectacle, but as warning. We are not finished yet. But now the story is ready for its final step. The one that no longer speaks of ships or battles, but of memory. When you say it is the last part, I will close this journey. The memory of HMS Hood does not live in victories. It lives in silence. It lives in the moment just after the explosion, when Prince of Wales was still moving forward and the sailors aboard were trying to understand how a ship of that size had simply ceased to exist. It lives in the wordless shock that swept through the entire Royal Navy when it realized that something fundamental had been lost. Not just a battlecruiser, but the sense of continuity, of inherited security from the past. Over the years, Hood stopped being remembered merely as the ship that sank too quickly. It came to occupy a deeper place, that of moral memory. A permanent reminder that war does not respect symbols, and that the human cost can be absolute even when combat lasts less time than it takes for a cup of coffee to go cold. The more than 1,400 men who died aboard her had no time to become heroes of long stories. They left no detailed accounts, no dramatic final scenes. And perhaps that is precisely why their memory feels so heavy. They vanished together, almost in the same second, claimed by a structural decision made long before their names were ever known. Today HMS Hood is a war grave. An untouched, respected site, where there is no talk of recovery or salvage. The ship belongs to the sea, and to history. Any attempt to turn it into something else would violate what it has become. When the Royal Navy remembers Hood, it does not do so to glorify the past. It does so to avoid repeating mistakes. To remember that technology, engineering, and doctrine must evolve with the real world, and that no reputation can replace that. And for the public, Hood remains a shock frozen in time. 3 minutes that condense everything modern war can be: fast, impersonal, irreversible. An event too brief to be fully understood in the moment, yet powerful enough to echo across generations. Perhaps the most honest legacy of HMS Hood is this: she did not fall in order to teach a lesson, but in falling she taught one. As long as this story is told with fidelity, without exaggeration, without romanticism, Hood will continue to fulfill her final role. Not as a weapon, not as an imperial symbol, but as a living memory of the real price of trusting the past in a world that has already changed. The pride of England was destroyed in 3 minutes. But the meaning of those 3 minutes is not finished. And as long as someone pauses in silence to remember HMS Hood, she will never have disappeared completely. There are stories that end with dates, others with clear victories or definitive defeats. The story of HMS Hood does not close that way. It remains open, suspended, like the very silence that followed the explosion. Because unlike many episodes of the war, Hood left no room for immediate heroic interpretation. There was no decisive counterattack, no recovery, no time for the narrative to be shaped in the heat of action. What remained was only the bare reality: a legendary ship destroyed almost instantly, taking nearly every man aboard with it. That single fact went on to exert a strange and lasting influence on British naval memory. Hood became a silent reference point in academies, planning rooms, and conversations among officers. Whenever excessive confidence was discussed, whenever tradition went unexamined, whenever dangerous delays were considered, the name Hood surfaced, sometimes explicitly, often only implicitly. It came to represent the invisible line between respect for the past and blind dependence on it. For the families of the crew, however, the story was never abstract. It remained concrete, daily, a permanent absence. Many grew up hearing that a father, brother, or grandfather served on the Hood. And that short, simple phrase carried everything: pride, grief, and an unanswered question: how could something like that happen so quickly? Over the years, ceremonies continued to be held. Not to reopen wounds, but to keep memory alive. Because forgetting Hood would also mean forgetting the ordinary men who trusted that ship until the very last second. Men who made no strategic decisions, designed no armor, defined no doctrines, who simply did their duty. And perhaps that is the hardest layer of this story. HMS Hood did not fail as a crew. It did not fail in discipline. It did not fail in courage. It failed as a symbol kept beyond its time. Today, looking back, it is easy to point out what should have been done. Reinforce the armor. Withdraw her from service for deep modernization. Avoid certain types of engagement. But those conclusions exist only because Hood fell. Before that, she seemed to work. She seemed sufficient. She seemed eternal. War proved otherwise. That is why the story of HMS Hood continues to be told. Not as spectacle, not as a technical curiosity, but as a human warning. A reminder that in modern conflict, the price of inertia can be paid in minutes, and in hundreds of lives. We are not yet at the final silence of this narrative. But now, everything that needed to be understood has been set before us. When you say this is the last part, I will close this story as it deserves to be closed. Without exaggeration. Without romanticism. Only with respect for what truly happened. In 3 minutes that changed war at sea. HMS Hood had no final request. No time for goodbyes. No chance to grow old in a quiet harbor, surrounded by memories. She ended as she had lived her final years, moving forward, confident, carrying expectations greater than her own structure could bear. When the sea closed over her wreckage, it took more than steel and cordite. It took an entire idea with it, the belief that tradition, prestige, and the past could substitute for adaptation. That morning in the Denmark Strait marked the exact moment that idea died, along with more than 1,400 men. 3 minutes. Not enough time for conscious fear. Not enough time for prolonged heroism. Only enough time for reality to impose itself. Absolutely. The sailors of HMS Hood did not fail. They trusted. They trusted the ship they served on, the navy they belonged to, the logic that had worked for decades. That trust was not naive, it was inherited. And that is precisely what made the tragedy so profound. After Hood, the naval world was never the same. No great ship was ever again seen as untouchable. No reputation was considered armor. No era was treated as permanent. Hood did not win her final battle. But she changed every battle that followed. Today she rests on the floor of the Atlantic as an inviolable war grave. A place where voices are lowered, where nothing is touched, where nothing is corrected, only respected. Because what lies there is not merely a destroyed ship, but the consequences of human, technological, and historical decisions concentrated into a single instant. The pride of England was destroyed in 3 minutes. But the meaning of those 3 minutes crossed generations. As long as this story is told truthfully, as long as we remember that real men were aboard, as long as we understand that symbols cannot replace reality, HMS Hood will continue to fulfill her final mission. Not as a weapon, not as a myth, but as a permanent memory of the true cost of modern war. And in that silence, deep, cold, and final, the story at last comes to an end.